Hello and welcome back to Rick's Woodworking. Today we're going to build a love seat for outside. I got started by trimming all the pieces to length. Like many of my projects, this is going to be built with construction lumber. This is pressure treated 2x4s. Now it's time to get rid of the round over edge on all those 2x4s. I set my fence to a width that's approximate for all the pieces. I'm now going to raise my blade just over the height of the 2x4. First pass gets rid of that first edge and gives me a good true edge to work with. And then second pass will set all the pieces to the right width and gets rid of the second edge. So what are we building? If you saw my video on how to build a chair, this will look very familiar. It's the same side profile. The legs are a little further apart, and there's an addition of 3 cross members to stiffen the frame. Let's get back to milling the boards. I ran all the pieces through my thickness planer. As you know, 2x4s are not known for their uniform thickness. This also helps with getting rid of some nasty marks on all the surfaces of the boards. A side benefit of using a surface planer or thickness planer, lots of sawdust. With all the boards milled, let's lay out for the half lap joints. I set the thickness of the upper board, that'll end up being the armrest, and now I'm going to find the center of this piece. With the center marked, I go 1 inch on either side to give me a 2-inch tenon. Now let's set up for cutting the half lap joints. I could have used a crosscut slit for all this, but I just decided to use an extension to my miter gauge. This is just a straight piece of 3/4 inch plywood that I keep reusing. Just make sure to move it around so I cut through different spots. I set the height of the saw blade to just touch the layout line. You can see where my initial line was off, but measure twice, I heard them say. First pass sets the cut in the miter gauge extension. Using the cut line, I can now mark the fence for the thickness of the boards. I will use that to set a stop block. Here are the results of my first pass cuts. A small adjustment and we'll be good to go. I cut the shoulders on all the legs and cross members. Once those are all cut, I will use my homemade tenoning jig to finish up the pieces. I want to make sure that all those small offcuts don't get caught by the blade, so between passes I push them away. And just like before, I cut all the pieces this way. Now back to the miter extension to start cutting the receiving slots for the tenons I just cut. I use a combination of a stop block and spacer to get the right width on the slots. These are all adjusted for the thickness of the boards and the thickness of the blade. And now I'm just going to nibble away at the pieces. Later I'll do this again for the cross members, but I'll use a stacked dado head cutter. And now let's test that fit. Perfect. I mocked up the seat bottom and assembled one leg so I could locate the cross members.
Using the pivot point of the square, I was able to gauge out the 10 degrees for the bottom of the seat, making it really comfortable to sit on for a long period of time. Extending that line down to the rear leg, I was able to establish where the other 2x4 cross member would be. Now both these lower pieces have a 10-degree bevel that I'll cut later. And by extension, I now have the point of my final cross member up here.
I can now cut the slots on the legs for the cross members. The 1/2-inch stacked dado blade makes this a lot easier. Like before, I use a combination of stop and spacer blocks to get the slot widths just right. You probably noticed that I left the blue tape on all the pieces. That's so that I could easily reference the lines and set up the cut. The front leg only gets one joint, but the back legs get two. To make this all happen, I used the same spacer block for all the cuts, but just moved the stop block to set each joint. Here I take care of the 10-degree bevel for the two bottom cross members. I made this simple jig so I could get consistent screw holes on each of the half-lap joints. Now some glue and assembly. I'm using waterproof glue on all the joints, and I make sure to spread it out as evenly as possible. More glue is better because I can always clean up the squeeze out, but I can never really add glue to the joints. I'm using two clamps to put pressure up on the leg so it fits snugly into the armrest. I then use an F-clamp to put pressure down so when the screws go in, they seat properly. Check for square, and now I can put the screws in. With all the screws in and the clamps removed, I check for square one more time. And of course, clean it. Because of how I made the joints, the glue would be strong enough to hold it all together, but I like adding the screws since this will be outside and there will be a lot of wood movement. I left the parts a bit long at the joints so I could sand them flush and smooth. A belt sander with an aggressive grit takes care of this quick. It's also great for rounding over the corners. I will follow all this up with my random orbital sander to get a smooth finish, down to about 150 grit. It's also a great time to do the cross members before I start assembly, because it'll get a lot harder after that. And just before I put everything together, I'll go over it with my router with an 1/8 inch roundover bit, so I take care of all the sharp edges on the armrest. Now to start assembling the cross members and create what looks more like a bench. You'll notice that I have some clamps down at the bottom to hold all the pieces up, and a pretty long pipe clamp so that I can bring the joints tight. After putting glue on all the surfaces, I slide the joints together and bring everything tight with the clamp. And as before, I'll use some F-type clamps to tighten up the half lap, making room for my drill and screws. Sometimes, not always. With the front cross member done, I'm going to do the lower rear cross member and get ready for the upper. With the mock-up in place, I can set the angle for the back bevel. It should be 22.5 degrees, and it just lines up. And so I'll take that out on the table saw. But notice I only take a little bit away. If I took more out, I'd compromise the half lap joint. And as you can see here, the piece sits flush. Now I will start milling the wood for the seat bottom supports. These are all 1.5 inches square, and like before, I'll use this table saw to trim the pieces to thickness. I want to use a half lap joint between the seat bottom and the back, so I'll set my miter gauge to 12.5 degrees. I now find the center point of the boards and set the saw blade to that height so I can nibble away at the material. I use my chisel to flatten the bottom of the cuts and then test the fit. Like before, glue on all the surfaces and a couple of screws to hold it all in place. And afterwards, some cleanup with a rag. To let the wood expand and contract, I will only use screws to hold the seat bottom supports to the bench frame. The overall width of the boards at the bottom and the back is 45 inches, so I decided to have a center support. You can also see that I am building two benches at the same time. When I built the easy chair, I used 2x4 lumber milled to 3/4 of an inch thick for the slats. Here I've decided to use decking boards. The boards come 5.5 inches wide, and that was too wide for the look I was going for, so I've milled them to 2.5 inches wide. The slats get a rounded edge on the router table to make sure your seat bottom doesn't hit sharp edges. I used an auxiliary fence mounted to my rib fence that has built-in dust collection to make this all happen. Like before, I made a jig to help set the screw holes. I then set up my assembly table with a stop block and center stop for the jig. I spent about 2 hours sanding all the slats using my random orbit sander, finishing at 150 grit sandpaper. Here I do a final pass by hand. Now I do some sorting. Since you can see all of the sides of the boards from the back of the bench, I want to make sure all the boards I use for that are free of knots and any leftover mill marks. I set a 1/2 inch spacer to allow the first board to hang over the seat supports. I then clamp the boards down and set in screws. I use a 3/4 inch spacer between the boards and lay out the rest of the seat bottoms. This first board is a bit tight because it's sitting between the legs. When I got to the back of the bench, I used the same 1/2 inch spacer to set the first board a bit past the supports. Now you think I'd be finished at this point, but after sitting down I realized the bottom was too long. So I decided to trim that bottom seat to get it closer to what I did again with the easy chair. A circular saw took care of the cuts real quick and easy. And I had only put one screw per slat, so it was pretty easy to just take it all apart and do it over again. And here are the finished benches out in the back patio. Some of the pressure treated lumber was really wet, so I need to let them weather before staining. But what do you think? Hope you enjoyed the video, and join us next time on Rick's Woodworking to see what else we will build.